that guy's a spy, this guy's a spy, and I'm in Chinatown. I'm seeing people physically attacking people. I'm seeing these large groups come out with signs, and people are getting death threats. People are coming up to me and they're telling, Chinese people, they're telling me, oh, they told me they can, threaten my family. They told me they can make me disappear. And, it's bizarre. I'd never encountered anything like this. I had no idea how to understand it. And so for me, the investigation was more, I had a lot of questions and I wanted to figure out what was going on and try to get to the bottom of it. I am proudly blacklisted, as is Epoch Times overall. We do have offices in Hong Kong and Taiwan, though, but mainland China, we've been blacklisted almost from the get-go. Well, blacklisted for some media means, of course, you have no visa. They don't tell you why you can't go there. You're never allowed to go, do research there or reporting there. For us, blacklisted started, I think, in 2000, soon after we launched Epoch Times. Chinese officials or Chinese police knocked on the door of some of our Chinese staff who were in China, arrested the entire office. Our editor spent 10 years in prison and they tortured him. So when he first got out, he did talk with me. I don't know the details about the torture. This was probably 5 years ago now I interviewed him. I can't remember. There were some public reports about his case. Of course, some of these journalist rights organizations did have some things on him. But his spirit wasn't crushed. He's still very much about getting the truth out in China. Somehow he hasn't been arrested again, so that's good to know. So when it comes to the way I view the Chinese regime, it's maybe a bit different from how a lot of people view it. The Chinese regime regards the United States as its #1 enemy. The very existence of a country that is based on the ideas of, say, individual rights, does defend internationally to some extent human rights. Does believe in this idea that if given basic freedoms, people can create a prosperous society. These things are antithetical to the narratives and the practices of the Chinese Communist Party. It tells people that they are not capable of creating a harmonious and functioning society if people are given freedom like we have here. And so challenging that, attacking the United States, undermining this perception is a huge part of what the Chinese regime is doing. And when it comes to their systems of warfare, of course, when we think war normally, we think tanks, guns, soldiers, jets, missiles, these kinds of things. When you're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, they're talking about culture, they're talking about drugs, they're talking about business warfare, cyber. They're talking about the basic perceptions, things like they have the 3 warfares doctrine: psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. How do you alter international perceptions of issues? How do you manipulate the, say, basic perceptions of a country in order to support or oppose what they want you to support or oppose? I'll use the South China Sea as an example, because this is a very clear example of that playing out. The 3 warfares doctrine is actually adopted into the Chinese military's strategy. It is an officially adopted military strategy. And it's based on 3 points. It's based essentially around manipulating the psychological and legal standpoints in order to obtain objectives. I mean, this sounds complicated, but let me explain it. Now, on the surface, psychological warfare is not necessarily propaganda, it's not necessarily misleading you. Psychological warfare is altering the conclusions you come to when observing information. It is changing the way you perceive something. Media warfare is a manipulation and control of, say, news outlets, social media, any outlet of information. Legal warfare is the manipulation of legal systems. They call it lawfare sometimes. But let's look at this in practice, okay? So when we look at the South China Sea, the Chinese regime used this to the T as a military strategy. What did they do? They start going into the South China Sea, building military bases, building artificial islands, putting up missile defense systems, you name it. Very hostile actions. Even challenging other nations, putting up an air defense zone, saying other countries can't enter their airspace without checking with them first. This is, it's conquering. It's traditional conquering. That's what they were doing. Just taking territory, saying it's ours, saying nobody can come in unless they tell us first, and we give them permission. But how did they take it? That is where the 3 warfares comes in. On the psychological warfare part, they created a narrative. And what was the narrative? The narrative was one of historical ownership of the region, one that painted China as a victim and gave them, of course, the perceived rights and even, say, justified actions of going in and taking this territory. They said they had historical ownership of this region. It was taken from them unjustly by Japan, by these different deals after World War II. That was the narrative they used. What did they do after that? They go into the media warfare element. It's very easy to manipulate the media. Since the documentary was released, there have actually been a lot of reports corroborating what we said. There are, of course, now investigations going into it, specifically on individuals that we directly point to, such as this Dr. Xi Zhengli, this Batwoman of China, as being one of the possible central figures in this entire thing. The U.S. is launching multiple investigations. I just reported, for example, they cut funding to an NIH program that was going to China. This Dr. Xi Zhengli is actually named in some of the reports on that. There was a Pentagon program that was also, it's being investigated right now, sending money to China. Other ones, many of them are mentioning Dr. Xi Zhengli. There's investigations into some of the U.S. universities, such as in Texas, and also, again, naming directly Dr. Xi Zhengli and this Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so it does appear that we, at the very least, contributed some evidence that may be helping some of these investigations. We'll have to see. When it comes to drug warfare, for example, how do you destroy the moral fabric of a society? We talk about things like these synthetic drugs, fentanyl, that comes from China. But what's actually not really as well known is that most of our drugs come from China. The drug cartels in Latin America, they get their precursor chemicals from China. In fact, there have been some reports saying that they're having trouble manufacturing because a lot of their labs they were getting their precursor chemicals from, for things like methamphetamine and other drugs, were coming from Wuhan, the epicenter of this virus. And so, you name it across the board. This is the real way they're bullying America. Here's a situation. This virus came at the worst possible time for the Chinese regime, strategically. It happened right at the height of the Hong Kong protests, when the authoritarian nature of the Chinese regime was being called out by the Chinese people themselves. When the people were waking up, when they showed, people in Hong Kong, knowing about the Tiananmen Square massacre, decided that they are willing to stand up to that regime, risking an action like that from the regime. The liaison department is under the general political department. This is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military. We all heard all this stuff about, Russian disinformation and Russian interference in our elections. China has an entire military department dedicated to this. The general political department, run through the liaison department, operating openly in New York City through the Chinese consulate website. There's a think tank, Project 2049 Institute had a whole report actually on the liaison department. The United States is going to launch an investigation into the origins of this virus and into whether the Chinese regime mishandled information, for example, through censoring it, which allowed it to spread internationally, left many countries unprepared for it. Many countries are calling them out. Even Iran, notably, is calling out the Chinese regime for this, for lying to them, for misleading them about how dangerous this virus was, about telling them that it was no big deal. And of course, a lot of the leadership have caught the virus, and a lot of the leadership is dying from it. In fact, there have been some reports noting how strange it is that it seems to be especially targeting the leadership of Iran. Iran is one of the Chinese regime's closest allies. You have the same thing with Russia. They're kicking out Chinese nationals. They're expatriating them. Russia as well bought a lot of Chinese PPE, this protective gear for the medical frontline workers, that's being found to be non-functional. A lot of countries are angry at the Chinese regime right now. Well, right now there's a big propaganda battle. This is the big area right now. The United States is, of course, calling for investigations into the Chinese regime, conducting investigations. There are international calls, Europe, different countries in the EU, the UK, Australia, Canada. You name it, they're calling for investigations. And the Chinese regime is trying to challenge those investigations through threats, through diplomatic threats. They're trying to challenge those investigations through financial threats. They're trying to challenge those investigations, especially through this new propaganda push. They're trying to shift blame and say the United States did not handle its response to the virus well. And they're trying to say the Chinese regime was being responsible, held off the virus for 2 months while the rest of the world could prepare for it. And of course, that's very easily debunked. The Chinese regime was, lying to the world about the severity of it, was lying to the world about human-to-human transmission, covered up the fact that there was human-to-human transmission, even when they knew it was the case. And then in the meantime, before they alerted the world, went and had, actually through the United Front, matter of fact, there were some reports in Canada saying the United Front was involved in this, had all their foreign networks go and buy up all the PPE, this protective gear, before they told the world about it. And so they were able to corner the entire global market on these protective medical gear. This is where it's at, this narrative battle, and they've already pretty much lost the narrative battle, it seems.